Today on Everyday Injustice, we're going to be talking about the Sacramento Police Department and an event that happened actually during the last round of protests back in June 2020, where police exercised excessive force against protesters. Stop me if we've heard this one before. So today on the show, we have Marissa Hatton from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, San Francisco Bay Area. And then we have Meg White, who is one of the plaintiffs in the case. So welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you. Thanks.
So Marissa, why don't you give us like an overview of what has happened and what the courts have decided at this point?
Sure. And then I'd love to turn it over to Meg to actually talk about, I can't talk about what happened in the streets of Sacramento in 2020, but I can talk about what happened legally since then. So, Meg and five other protesters, among, thousands of people, went out and protested George Floyd's murder over the course of several days in May and June of 2020. Later in that year, there was the 2020 presidential election, and it's kind of wild to think of these two things happening in the same year, but there were also the Stop the Steal protests, which were largely organized by white supremacist groups and Trump supporters. And again, Meg and other racial justice protesters came out and counter-protested those demonstrations. And so after the mass violence that ensued, which again, Meg can speak to because she lived it, we filed a lawsuit, us, Lawyers Committee, along with two partners, Disability Law United and a law firm called Siegel, Yee, Brunner, and Mehta, filed a civil rights lawsuit, suing not any individual officers because the violence was so widespread and pretty consistent across all officers. And also, we were never able to find out who injured our clients, but directly suing the city of Sacramento and the Sacramento Police Department for First Amendment retaliation, First Amendment viewpoint discrimination, Fourth Amendment violations, and then, kind of a host of state law claims, assault, battery, Ralph Act, and Bain Act, which prevent discrimination and violence on account of political affiliation. That got litigated for many, many years. In about December of last year, we went to summary judgment. The defendants tried to get rid of the case at that point. They lost, and we moved forward to a trial, which was held at the end of March and beginning of April of this year. Before we went to trial, we actually went to settlement and got a settlement from the defendants for the monetary piece of this. There's two things that were kind of in question. One was, how are you going to compensate our clients for what they lived through and what you did to them? And two, how are you going to change going forward? Because change is desperately needed in the way that Sacramento police's protests. And so the monetary piece was much easier to negotiate with the police department. They ended up settling for $350,000 for the six plaintiffs. But the piece that we could not come to agreement on was changes, concrete changes going forward. And so we had a 2-week trial there. Most of the plaintiffs testified, some witnesses who had been at the protests, and also the police chief, the current police chief, who was the deputy police chief in 2020. The outcome, and I think we'll talk more about the content of the trial, but the outcome of this was that the judge said, yes, these were Fourth Amendment violations on a mass scale that can be attributed to the police department, which for complicated legal reasons is very hard to get a police department as opposed to individual officers held liable. That police used overwhelming use of force, which is a tactic that's illegal, and that it engaged in an unconstitutional pattern and practice of Fourth Amendment violations in 2020, that it failed to properly train and it failed to properly discipline its officers at that time. The piece that we didn't get was permanent injunctive relief or change going forward, primarily because after 2020, or at least, in the court's view, this is why, after 2020, the California legislature passed some laws. Ostensibly, I think maybe with what's going on in LA, we can see that it didn't really change anything, but ostensibly changing the way that police are required to engage with protesters when they use kinetic impact munitions and when they use chemical weapons. And so the judge said, given those changes in the law, I can't be certain that the same thing would happen in the future, and I have to have certainty if I'm going to permanently join the police department. So substantively, legally, there was recognition of what happened in the past being unconstitutional. Going forward, unfortunately, there's not any concrete change with regard to how the police use those kinds of weapons.
Wow. All right. So, Meg, what was it like?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I guess which part, right? The initial thing that I think motivated a lot of folks, as well as myself, to move out into the streets was the lack of recognition and change to be made from other avenues. I know for me personally and lots of other community members, we tried to find so many other avenues to motivate change and to stop the exploitation and abuse that goes on for different impacted communities. We tried talking to our city officials. We tried going to city council meetings. We tried talking to the police. We tried going to their community meetings. And the example that I gave was like feeling like it was a suggestion box over a trash can. It was just like we were talking to a brick wall. And so really out of the sheer terror and frustration of not being able to stop people from being abused and killed just on our tax dollars, with our tax dollars, we then moved into the streets to primarily peacefully protest, and were just met with an insane amount of force. And there were several depositions done by different law enforcement officers, and the way that they were just allowed to blatantly lie, they would say that they gave us warnings before, that they didn't put their hands on us, in the face of body cam footage that they would be watching, where they would in fact have not given us any warnings, have put their hands on us. And there really was just absolutely no accountability from this to happen at all. And for me, the court process itself was also wildly exploitive, and kind of left me feeling the same amount of frustration that we as taxpayers just keep forking out more money and aren't able to get any real change on the back end of it.
Wow. And so, there's a lot to kind of unpack here. But one of the rulings here or findings was Fourth Amendment violation proven. They used excessive force, rubber bullets. I know a guy who was supposedly a legal observer, got hit in the head with a rubber bullet, and he's never been the same.
Yeah. Yeah, Danny, I think is who you're talking
Yes.
about. National Lawyers Guild. Yeah, and I mean, it was blatant that he was actually specifically targeted. Like, police pointed at him as somebody who was not only a legal observer, but somebody who was rising up the ranks as a civil rights activist in the legal field, and gave him permanent mental damage, so he will never be able to impact this work in the way that he would have. And same again, absolutely nothing has been done to hold those officers accountable or to change that from happening in the future. And so it feels like we extensively have just been like, our First Amendment rights have been taken away. And now I know for me personally, I don't feel safe going out there protesting anymore. I feel like the same thing that happened to Danny could very easily happen to me. And now I'm completely out of the ranks from being able to help my community.
Well, or worse.
Right.
I mean, we've been watching what's been happening down in LA and in other cities. I mean, if anything, the guardrails are off.
Yeah, well, I think that's part of the real deep harm that's done here, is that we've all, in live 5K footage, seen the way that police officers are totally allowed and funded to violate our rights violently, and they've been given the green light to be allowed to continue doing this. The message that they've received is that it's okay, and that they're not going to be held accountable, and that this is acceptable behavior.
Your thoughts on this, Marissa?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is all absolutely right, and Meg is really outlining why people have every right to feel angry and terrified going out into the streets. And when she says they've received the message that this is okay, that's literal. When we were in trial, we played the video of Danny Garza being shot while wearing his bright green legal observer hat, and he is just standing on the side of the street, and he gets shot and crumples to the ground. We went through internal affairs investigations. There were over 200 uses of force that police self-reported. far more uses of force than that, but they self-reported over 200. Some of those were folks who were hospitalized or seriously injured. Of those 200, all were reviewed by internal affairs. Only 8 were even flagged as improper. 5 of those just received retraining, which means, your supervisor comes and talks to you, but it's not formal discipline, doesn't go in your record. And 2 of them were not meaningfully, substantively investigated by internal affairs. And those 2 involved people who were shot in the head with less lethal weapons, which can be lethal, both of whom have permanent brain damage, one of whom had multiple fractures to the skull. And all the officers involved in those shootings, which is, upwards of 10 officers, were exonerated. So, to me, the idea that this might not happen again is a bit absurd. When we saw such mass violence in the streets, I would expect a police department that meant to change or felt any amount of guilt about that would have, engaged in massive change, quite a bit of discipline, retraining, etc. We didn't see any of that. In fact, we saw the police department say loud and clear to these officers, everything you did was totally fine in our eyes. I don't think there's any reason to expect that those officers would go out and act any differently in the future.
And I feel the need to ask this question because what we see and what we've seen this week is, kind of this justification that, people are being violent or people are rioting. I mean, were the police responding to something that they had a legitimate need to use force, or did they simply overreact to a situation that they were unprepared for?
Meg, I think you should talk about that from the viewpoint of, living it and being in the streets. I can talk about it from the legal standpoint and what the judge, I think, said or didn't say on that.
Sure. I think for me, being maybe a little bit optimistic, had hoped that at least the shared agreement was that police are here to protect people and to protect the community. And I think what I've seen firsthand is that they are more concerned with property and happy to forfeit livelihood or actual lives for the sake of that property. I know for me, if I think that somebody has stolen something from me, I'm not allowed to break into their house and beat them up and try to get back. There are legal procedures that I have to go through to prove that something has been stolen and then recover that property. And for some reason, law enforcement, who is charged with enforcing the laws, doesn't seem like they have to be responsible for actually following those very same laws that we pay them and trust them to enforce, and so decide to use violence instead. I don't think is a means to necessarily get to a place of justice, but instead just to kind of quell and quiet down and really stamp out anybody's desire and ability to fight for justice or civil rights.
Yeah, and to your question, David, were they unprepared for this? I think to some degree, yes. The judge found the Sacramento Police Department liable for failure to train its officers. They weren't trained on using these less lethal weapons, which are grenade launchers that are shot out of 40-millimeter guns. It's bullet type weapons, explosives, etc. They were not trained, and the evidence we showed in trial was that they weren't trained to use those for crowd control. But nonetheless, they did, and they did so indiscriminately, repeatedly, night after night after night. I think what I have seen and the testimony that we heard at trial was when people go out to express themselves and they feel that they are heard and they feel that their message has been received, they typically go home without incident. They go out, they express themselves. Police can even facilitate in that. That's a best practice for police. And then, it ends. It's when police come and ratchet things up, when they come dressed in full riot gear, when they come holding ammunition. And, at least in 2020, the National Guard came with live ammunition, not just less lethal ammunition. That's when people feel, I'm out here and it's justified. I'm out here and my message is not heard. And that's when you get conflict. That's when you get difficulty. But all the escalation that I've seen, and I've watched hundreds of hours of body-worn camera footage, was on part of the police and not protesters. So if they really wanted things to be calm in the streets, they would just let people, exercise their First Amendment rights and leave them alone.
Yeah, and that's what we've been seeing this week is the notion that coming in heavy-handed actually escalates problems that wouldn't have existed otherwise. If if you simply allow people to say their thing and make their protest, things go a lot more smoothly. It's amazing how that freedom of speech thing is kind of wise.
Yeah, I think one thing that I was surprised to see even on the initial states was how law enforcement would jump to violence so quickly. It was just common practice for you to be standing there on the sidewalk, and as they're coming by with a whole kind of parade of bike cops, they would just use their bikes to hit you as they are walking by, and you're just standing there, not even yelling, not chanting, not doing anything. But I think that really goes to show again the attitude of them going out there not to protect the community or to protect our rights, but instead to use force to shut us down and to silence us.
And so it seems like the biggest concern about the ruling is the lack of injunctive relief, so that that there's not going to be any way to prevent future harms. In terms of everything else, I mean, they cited training and oversight failures. I'm shaking my head a little bit because it's easy to cite training failures, but I don't think it really is training failure. I mean, do you really have to be trained not to shoot somebody in the head with a rubber bullet?
Right.
I mean, and if you do, was that safe for the caliber of officers that we have?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I think what we haven't talked a lot about yet is the juxtaposition of, the protests that happened after George Floyd was murdered and the Stop the Steal protests later in the year. But that's, the same year, the same police department. And as far as we can tell from the evidence we have, they didn't fire a single weapon during those protests. And those were thousands of people in the street. They came out every Saturday from November to March, at least 20 times. So, it's not a matter of training, and it's not a matter of lack of self-discipline or control. It's very much a reaction to viewpoints either that the police agree with or don't agree with, and they'll use violence accordingly.
Yeah, and that's something that I chillingly saw firsthand, where there would literally be a social justice protester with the exact same thing that a Stop the Steal protester has. The Stop the Steal protester maybe receives a ticket very peacefully, while the social justice protester gets body slammed, dragged to prison, held overnight for the exact same infraction. And I mean, one case that I witnessed that's fully on camera was a Stop the Steal protester attempting to mace a crowd of people and then running into a parking garage to hide behind law enforcement, who then protected and did nothing about the fact that this person just tried to bear mace a whole crowd of people. So it was the message was really made clear that this has to do not with what you're doing, but what your viewpoint is.
And Marissa, from your perspective, I mean, it seems to me, listening to this conversation, that freedom of speech, protest, expression wasn't well served by this ruling.
I think that would be accurate to say, both because the face of the ruling doesn't really engage with the First Amendment claims that we brought, and the arguments that we made in court. So it doesn't address the First Amendment retaliation, which is what Meg is talking about, being targeted based on your viewpoint. It doesn't address the First Amendment viewpoint discrimination, which was the difference between the way that the police treated racial justice protesters and white supremacists. I do think, and again, the legal system is pretty good at allocating dollars. So if you're harmed, the police or the legal system can, get you money for that harm. It's good at, assessing and turning things into dollar amounts. It's much worse at turning things into social change. It's also pretty good at, enabling more and more lawsuits. So what I mean by that is this: the ruling that we got, I think, doesn't advance First Amendment rights in the streets in a way that people like Meg or the community are going to feel immediately. Because frankly, I don't think that there's going to be any change in the police department in the way that it goes out and polices protests. What I do think the ruling does for First Amendment rights does make things a little bit easier for future lawsuits and litigants. Again, whether those people will get meaningful change or they'll just get money, I don't know. But one of the hardest things to do in a lawsuit against a police department is, well, let me just back up a little bit for non-lawyers. So suing a police department as the employer of an officer that hurt you is not as easy as suing, like the cable guy comes to your house and breaks a window and you can sue the cable company because he's an employee. States have sovereign immunity. They can't be sued directly by citizens. There's a carve out for that for municipalities under a case called Monell, which means you can sue police departments, but you have to show that the harm that happened was part of a longstanding pattern or practice. And so that's what us civil rights lawyers deal with, is how do you show any given harm is a longstanding pattern or practice so that, your client being shot or beaten can be attributed to the police department because it's part of a pattern or practice. It's typically a pretty hard showing. That's why people try to find the specific officers that hurt them, because actually getting the whole department itself to be liable is difficult, and particularly that piece of long-standing pattern or practice. I think what this case did for future protests is that the judge said, these protests happened over the course of 3 days. I'm finding that sufficient as a pattern or practice, a long-standing one. I think that's in the context of other protests in Sacramento regarding, Stephon Clark being murdered by the police. But that kind of three-day period, as far as I can tell, this is the only post-trial ruling from any George Floyd lawsuit. And so finding out that 3 days is enough to create a pattern sufficient to make a police department liable, I think does advance protesters' rights in the future. For instance, in LA right now, those protests have been going on for at least 6 days. That is enough, at least under our judge's reasoning and the precedent set by our case, for those protesters to hold the LAPD liable in the future. So again, I think it's not totally meaningful for people who are going to be gassed and shot. Those things are still going to happen, but at least with regard to getting some sort of relief, monetary relief, the opinion does advance that type of relief.
But Meg, from your perspective, you feel like your future protest prospects have been chilled by all this.
Oh, dramatically. And the process itself was so wildly exploitive, and it seems like we are literally just setting ourselves up for the folks that for taxpayers to pay more money for no accountability for law enforcement. Law enforcement has had nothing negative happen to them aside from some of them having to go through some depositions. Meanwhile, taxpayers are going to have to shell out millions of dollars in legal fees and a couple $100,000 for the plaintiffs themselves to have gone through the issue. And while I know that the actual inner workings of the settlement conferences are confidential, I think that I can broadly speak to the point that we were totally hoodwinked and bamboozled and straight out lied to by the city with this idea that our monetary settlement was going to be connected to some change, only for at the last minute for them to give us a few pennies for the extreme trauma and life-changing injuries that we were dealing with, only to say, oh, and by the way, we're not going to make any changes at all. So it feels like for me as a community member, I invested a bunch of time only to get a little bit of my own tax dollars back, to have to shell out much more in legal fees from this community fund, and then to still have nobody held accountable and no meaningful change actually made.
Marissa, your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that that's absolutely right. I think that, for the things that are really meaningful to the community members and the people who put their bodies on the line and their time on the line. I mean, like I said, this case was litigated for 5 years. It's a heavy emotional toll. And really, in terms of what happens and the things that they care about, the legal system does not provide that relief. And I think also is pretty, you know, I don't want to say disrespectful because that sounds like I'm talking about a specific person, but as a system, um, I think that there's not the respect given to people like Meg and our 5 other plaintiffs who are actually working on behalf of the entire city, right? They're working on safety for not just a certain type of protest, but all protests and all people in the city. And honestly, police officers themselves, taxpayers, all of us would be better off without violence. All of us would be better off with safe protesting conditions. And, you know, all that labor goes for the most part uncompensated, unrecognized. And then again, the chances of success are very low. So I think, you know, people like our plaintiffs are not doing this for money. They're doing it to try to create change. And unfortunately, what the legal system can provide is just money. So it's really unfortunate. And I think, yeah, I totally agree with Meg.
And I just wanted to ask this question because I think it really relates both to what happened, 4 or 5 years ago and what's happening now, is that it felt like for a long time that kind of the police had kind of figured out how to handle these protests and not turn them into front page news, and not turn them into these kind of police riots and whatnot. And it seems like in the last 10 years that's gone by the window. And maybe we go back to Ferguson and the militarized police response, but that seemed like the turning point. And then it seems like it's just been ratcheting up. Whereas we kind of know how to deal with these things, and you kind of just let people do whatever they're going to do, and then you deal with whatever happens later. But we've completely lost that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And for my my personal experience, I don't mean to put any sort of moral compass on how folks who are dealing with injustice and exploitation decide to handle that and respond to that and try to fight against it. But for me personally, I didn't loot, I didn't break any windows, I didn't break any laws, I wasn't violent with anyone. I don't think I did anything other than potentially jaywalking, and still I was maced in the face, I was beaten, I was ended up with a bulging disc in my back. I still have nightmares about the stuff that happened, obviously dealing with what Google would certainly diagnose as PTSD. And that was for somebody that was, for all violent purposes, following the law. And it seems like even at that baseline of literally just exercising your First Amendment rights is going to be met with life-altering violence.
And that seems to be something that gets missed in this discussion. Like, people will say, oh, they're burning vehicles, they're doing this, they're doing that. But usually the people that get beaten and hurt are not the people doing those things.
Sure.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, penal code definition of what an unlawful assembly is. In California, it's just 2 or more people, engaged in, I can't recall the exact language right now, it's violence or boisterous behavior or something like that. That was something discussed at trial for us, but it was, I think filtered and talked about through the First Amendment, which changes things for how you respond and whether something can or should be an unlawful assembly. So I think that at least the judge made the right decision there by saying, look, I understand that, I saw videos of buildings, pepper or spray painted. I saw windows broken, etc. But with regard to the plaintiffs, they didn't engage in any of that behavior. And so any force against them was unjustified. Um, Again, the legal system can only, retrospectively, I think, at least for now and the way things are, address this kind of mass indiscriminate group punishment for what ends up being a relatively small number of people who are engaged in those types of behaviors. So for us, and what our police practices expert testified about in trial is that, the most important part of crowd psychology and policing protests is differentiation, being able to differentiate between the people who are actually causing problems and to target police enforcement at them and to leave everyone else alone. And so that's what I really hope to see happen, if there are additional lawsuits. But, again, so far, I think with the militarization of police and the fact that they're not being held accountable for this indiscriminate violence, I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon.
And it feels like things are about to get worse, not better.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the big takeaway. Go ahead, Meg.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah, that is definitely how it looks, which is why it's even more shocking in the current climate that we're in for the judge to say that he didn't feel like he had the authority, or felt like he should use his authority rather, to put any protections in place for the community.
All right. Well, we're going to end on that downer note. Want to thank Marissa Hatton and Meg White for coming and sharing this story, which unfortunately I think we're going to see a replay of over the next 12 months, and probably multiple lawsuits. And in a few minutes, we're going to find out if it's legal for the president to just send in troops into US cities. So that's kind of the world we're in right now. And I have to kind of laugh, otherwise I cry.
Yeah, I feel that.
So thank you guys for coming on. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system.